Scripture reading this evening will come from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 16 through 17. At my first defense, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. May it not be charged against them. But the Lord stood by me and strengthened me, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed, and all the Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth.
Have your Bibles, you can open to 2 Timothy chapter 4. We'll focus our attention there for a few minutes this evening. Over the last couple of weeks, or maybe I guess more than that, that wouldn't be an accurate statement. Over the last couple of months, there have been relationships in my life and in our life, people that we were close to and had gotten close to that it's not that way anymore. Maybe you can think of people in your life like that, where you had developed close relationships with people, or maybe you had invested a lot in a person, and then after some time, that person hurts you. And the older you get, and even the longer that you create relationships with people, it still doesn't get any easier to get close to people and to invest in people, even people like your church family. It's hard to really get to know people and invest in their lives because you're scared. You're scared of what's going to happen when they disappoint you or how they're going to let you down. And even like that when we're developing relationships, like when we're younger, maybe we're looking for the person that we're going to marry or spend the rest of our life with. We're really scared about opening up and being vulnerable because we know that loving people is really hard. And it's really hard because when we love people, people disappoint us because they're humans. They let us down. I was reading not long ago an article that C.S. Lewis wrote, and I thought it was interesting. He said, "To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung or broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully with little luxuries and hobbies, but avoid all entanglements. Lock it up in the coffin of your selfishness, but in that coffin, safe and dark, motionless and airless, it will change. It won't be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love really is to be vulnerable." When we think about love and we think about relationships that we've had with other people and the reality of the fact that the closer we get to people sometimes, even people that we have high expectations of or think that something like this would never happen, the reality is people just hurt us. They disappoint us or they let us down. And if you choose to love, then you really only have two options. You can protect your heart, and it will become hard over time. That the more you try to be reserved and not open up to people and not let people into your life and involve yourselves in other people, then really over time your heart just gets hard. That's what C.S. Lewis mentioned. Or the other option is you can love. You can be vulnerable. You can take risk. You can invest in people's lives and let people into yours, and inevitably your heart will be broken. And how you choose to respond in that situation, one or the other, it will determine the kind of life that you live. And in large part, I guess it would determine what kind of church we are at Chisholm Hills. So before I ever dive into the passage tonight, 2 Timothy chapter 4, I chose verses 16 and 17, but really will broaden our scope. I want to encourage you to think about a couple of things. When it comes to your relationships with people that you have, your church family, people that you're close with, choose to take a risk. Choose to get hurt. Choose to let people in. Choose to be surrounded by community, even though it's a little bit scary sometimes to invite people into your life. Let people see the real you. Don't put up a mask. Don't put up a facade. Let people see the real you, and lean into your church family and lean into people around you so that they can see, or rather that you can see the real them, like you get to know who they are at their core. I know for a fact that if you do those things, you will get hurt. It's inevitable, but I know that you can do it. When you get to the end of 2 Timothy chapter 4, really the end of 2 Timothy as a whole, Paul sort of winds down the letter to Timothy like he always does, and in every letter with some sort of practical exhortation or something of the sort. And there's only two times Paul does it this way that I know of, and that's in Romans and in 2 Timothy. And he chooses to conclude the book with 17 names, 18 if you include Timothy, but he mentions 17 people by name at the end of the book. And it's kind of a weird weird way to wrap up the letter, especially when you consider the fact that most of those people, we don't know how to pronounce their name. We really don't know much about them other than the fact that they're mentioned maybe one or two other times aside from this instance. But the fact of the matter is, if you pass over what you read beginning in verse number 9 of 2 Timothy 4, you've missed something very valuable. Tonight I want to talk about relationships and how we relate to other people, specifically choosing to risk it, choosing to involve ourselves in the lives of other people and to let people see the real us, even though that thought is very scary, right? The first thing you need to know tonight when you look at 2 Timothy chapter 4 is that people will disappoint you. People will disappoint you. I think we've already pointed that out, but I want you to glance even right there at verse number 10. Paul's begging Timothy to come see him soon. At this point, Paul's in prison in Rome. He had been through all of the preliminary trials. The sentence and the verdict had been named. Paul was in prison, and he was alone. He was without anybody. And so he says in verse 9, I hope that Timothy will come see me soon, essentially because I'm lonely. But it doesn't go very far in the text. You don't have to read very far before you realize that there was someone that Paul did care about that actually disappointed him at one time. Look at verse 10. Demas has departed from me, or deserted me, some translations say, since he loved this present world and has gone to Thessalonica. Look down at verse number 14, and you see he mentions Alexander the coppersmith, who did great harm to him. Or then you look down at verse number 16, and you see that at his first defense, probably talking about something like the pre-trial, the preliminary stages of Paul's being tried before a Roman government, no one stood with him. No one came to stand beside him, but everyone deserted him. Now you think about Paul, and you think about the life that he lived as far as relationships with people are concerned, and you could argue that there was probably no one beside Jesus that poured his life into the lives of other people than the Apostle Paul did. That he made it his mission. When you read through the book of Acts or you read through all the epistles, Paul literally poured into so many people every day. That was his life mission. And it didn't matter if it was Jews or Gentiles or anybody in between, if they were poor or rich or educated or not. It was like Paul's life mission was to pour into their life so that they could experience Jesus in a more full way. If anything, those people that we just read in verse 10, verse 14, and verse 16, if anybody had anything for Paul, they owed him their life. I mean, they owed him all kinds of things because of the way that he invested in them spiritually. And the only thing he received was Demas leaving him, Alexander the coppersmith doing great harm to him, and all of these other people that probably should have come to his aid, and they did nothing. Now, there were some friends in the text that left for legitimate reasons. Like in verse number 10, it says that Crescens had gone to Galatia and Titus to Dalmatia. Those two guys were doing ministry. Verse 12, I sent Tychicus to Ephesus, so he left for a legitimate reason. But there were a few people in this passage that had no legitimate reason to leave. They literally just deserted Paul. They literally left him high and dry. They disappointed Paul to his core after all the things that Paul had done for him. After all the ways that Paul had invested in him, you could say that Paul let down his barriers and got to know them on a real level and let them know the real Paul, that he had gotten down to a great relationship with them. Even after all that Paul had poured into him, they turned their back on him, and he still found himself alone, hurt by the people that he loved. I read that passage and I read those verses like verse 10, verse 14, verse 16. And I guess I have to keep reminding myself that even the people that I trust, the people that I have the highest expectations for, yeah, even sometimes our church family, it is the case that people will hurt you. They disappointed Paul, those friends did, those Christians did, and it is the case that sometimes the people that we least expect will do that to us. I know for a fact that when you look at people's lives and you listen to their stories, they'll readily admit to you that relational pain is one of the biggest and hardest pains to deal with in their life. That they look back and over the course of their life, they think about all the things that caused them pain. And usually those wounds that cut the deepest, that hurt the deepest, are relational pains. They're problems or rifts that maybe you had with someone that you were close with or someone that you deeply cared about. And while those relationships could be the source of the greatest joy in our life, it is often the case that they're the source of the greatest pain. People are going to hurt us, right? That's fact number one about 2 Timothy 4, 9 and following, Paul points out the fact that there were some good people, some Christian people that he loved and poured into, some people that he had high expectations for, even his church family, that hurt him and let him down. So then we shift our attention to number 2. What do we do about that? What happens? How did Paul respond when people disappointed him? And I would argue point number 2, or maybe I should label point number 2, is stand by people. Those same people that hurt you, stand by those people. The temptation would be to withdraw. When someone hurts me, they're done, right? I'm done with them. I don't want to get to know them anymore. Don't want to have a relationship with them anymore. They hurt my family. They hurt me. And sometimes we wall off and we shut down. And you see that in churches. You see it in families. You just see it in everyday life because that's how we naturally tend to deal with problems when people hurt us or hurt our families, is just to wall them off and to box ourselves off and not have anything to do with those people anymore. But I want you to notice a couple of things in 2 Timothy 4 that stood out to me even after all of these bad things happened. Paul was alone. No one stood with him. He was hurt because some of these people that he cared about deeply, they left him all alone, sad by himself. But listen to a couple of things he says in the passage that makes me appreciate Paul more. In verse number 9, he's begging Timothy, please come to be with me soon. In verse number 11, he mentions Luke is with me, but he also says, bring Mark, who is with you, for he is useful to me in the ministry. That's a big deal because early in Paul's ministry, when he started those missionary journeys, Mark hurt Paul. You remember that Paul was taking John Mark on the missionary journey, the first one, and John Mark went home for whatever reason, and it hurt Paul. Paul was upset to the point that when Barnabas wanted to bring him on the second, Paul says, no, he turned his back on us. He left us. Paul was hurt and affected because he had poured into John Mark. John Mark disappointed him, but now years later in Paul's life, after a period of spiritual maturity and growth, Paul wanted Mark back. Paul wanted that relationship to progress, and he wanted it to grow, as if to say, I have realized that the way to handle people that disappoint me is not to just eliminate them, but it's to double down and pour into their lives even more. You could argue that Paul wanted to pour into the lives of people more that hurt him than he did before they wanted to. That he did make it a point to pour into people's lives and invest in them. But even after all these people let him down, it's like he wanted to do that even more. He wanted to show them how much he loved them. When you look at verse 19, he talks about Prisca and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus remained in Corinth. He left Trophimus sick at Miletus. Make every effort to come before winter. Eubulus is greeting you, as so is Pudens and Linus and Claudia and all the brothers and sisters. The Lord be with your spirit. Grace be with you all. I read about how Paul was just constantly wanting people to come and be with him, even after he stated, I had this opportunity for people to come to my aid, and they disappointed me, and they didn't come. All of these people had a chance to come aid me in this trial in Rome. In fact, it was a thing in Rome, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute, but it was a thing in Rome when someone was on trial, they could have an advocate. They could have a witness. It was like Paul was saying, you had an opportunity to be here and you didn't. Even after all of that, after people disappointed Paul, he still wanted to stand by them. They abandoned him. He's doubling down to pour into their heart. John Piper wrote a book called Why I Love the Apostle Paul. I have it in my office back there. I've read it several times. And this was an excerpt from one of the chapters in his book about the Apostle Paul. And he was reflecting on love and the way that Paul loved other people. And this is what he says. He says, we in the modern West, in the last few hundred years or so, have a love affair with the strong, independent, self-sufficient, self-assertive hero who accomplishes great feats against all odds with little or no help from other people. As a whole, it isn't the kind of life that Paul extolled, encouraged, or modeled. As if to say, we always want the guy who can do it all on his own, that doesn't need any help. That's the kind of person we think has it all figured out. John Piper argues about Paul, that was never the case. He says about him, in his entire ministry, as you read in the epistles and Acts, Paul always traveled and ministered with other people. The instances that look like they might be exceptions only prove the rule when you examine them closely. I read that second little phrase there, that when you look at Paul's ministry, that he always traveled with or ministered with someone else, as if to say he chose to never be alone in his ministry, even when he was hurt, even at a point where he was alone and people had disappointed him. And the temptation for us would be to just say, you know what, forget those people. They didn't stand with me. They hurt me. They disappointed me. It's like Paul was saying, no, I still want to pour into you. I still want you to come and be with me. I still want to work on this relationship. He didn't become jaded. He didn't become cynical. He didn't become bitter. It was like, I just want to serve and I want to love you even more. Christianity is highly relational. I mean, the whole New Testament is about community and family and finding those relationships with each other. We need each other. But Paul makes a case, I think, in 2 Timothy 4, that need for other people is heightened even more after they hurt us. We still need each other even after we disappoint one another. So we have people that disappoint Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 4. The response to that situation is Paul standing by those people even after he hurt them. And that sounds like a nice idea, but then we say, okay, Paul, how could you do that? Which leads me to this idea. Stand by people that hurt you because God stands by you. Look closely at 2 Timothy chapter 4 and key in on verse number 16. How was Paul able to rise above the pain of the disappointment that he had for the people that let him down? For good Christian people, people that he had high expectations for, that hurt him, that abandoned him, how was Paul able to rise above the pain? Robbie read for us a minute ago. At my first defense, no one stood by me, but everyone deserted me. May it not be counted against them. That was Paul's response, which is massive to me. But the Lord stood with me, verse 17, and strengthened me so that I might fully preach the word and all the Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil work and bring me safely into his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. I alluded to the fact earlier that in Roman cases, court cases, those who were being tried were able to bring an advocate or a witness to serve beside them through the trial process, and they could advise them on how to handle their case. If, say, the judge gave them a choice, this person could advise them on what to do in the situation. They could be there just for moral support. Like, there was an opportunity for someone to be there with Paul while he was being tried. And you think about all the Christians in Rome. All of the Christians in Rome that could have come to Paul's defense, and no one did. Not one person showed up to be there with Paul in this trial. Out of all the Christians that he knew, 17 specifically mentioned right here in 2 Timothy 4. Count that with the number that he mentions in Romans 12. And I get that those people were scattered abroad, but I mean, even all of those Christians that he knew that had the opportunity to be with him in that moment of trial, no one came. Everyone deserted him except for one person that mattered more than anyone else in the whole world. He says in 2 Timothy 4, 16 through 18, it was the Lord who stood by me. Not just stood by him, he did three things. The first, right there in verse number 17, he mentions that the Lord stood by him, as if to say, I looked around and no one of my physical family or friends, no one was there, but I could count on God never leaving me. The Hebrews writer in Hebrews 13 and verse number 5 mentions something like that. The Lord will never leave me or forsake me, the Hebrews writer says. Therefore, never will I fear what man can do to me, because God won't leave me. I know that other people will disappoint me, but I can always count on the fact that God is standing right beside me. But then he mentions this in verse number 17. The Lord strengthened me so that I might fully preach the word. I'm standing here in chains in front of a Roman court, and I know that I'm probably going to prison and that I might very well die. I could receive the death sentence for what I've been doing. And even in a moment where, humanly speaking, Paul would have been exhausted, completely exhausted. People have let him down. He's being tried for something that he really didn't even do wrong. I mean, all he was doing was just preaching the gospel. And then all of those things combined with the emotions and the pressure, yeah, that's hard. Humanly speaking, it's exhausting. He says, but God gave me strength. He gave me strength to tell that Roman court what Jesus would do for them. He gave me the strength to preach the gospel, even when humanly it was impossible. When I was so exhausted, I couldn't do it. Then he says, God rescues me. Verse 18, the Lord will rescue me from every evil work. And he even mentions in verse 17, I was rescued from the lion's mouth. I thought that phrase was interesting. Commentators disagreed on what that actually meant. Some say that Paul was talking about from the hands of the Roman government itself. Some people say that that Paul was talking about Satan and the tools that Satan was using to work in his life. And others say that he was talking about death in general, just the fact that he was about to die. But either case, it really doesn't matter. God was there through them all. If Paul had been delivered over to a Roman governor, say Nero, God would have been there the whole time. If he would have been a tool in the hands of Satan, or Satan was using these tools to hurt Paul or to hinder Paul or keep him from moving, God would have been there the whole time. And even in the face of death, well, we know what Paul said about that in Philippians chapter 1. I know what I'm looking forward to. To live as Christ and to die as gain. That's what he says, Philippians 1 and verse number 21. Why could Paul stand by the people that hurt him? Like, why could Paul write, after all of the ways that people let him down, even good Christian people, people that he had high expectations for, why could Paul still want to pour in the lives of other people? Because he realized that even after he had disappointed God on occasion, because he was human and he had sins and he had problems, even after he disappointed God, God stood by him. And that gave him the power to stand by people even after they had disappointed. So we have then 2 Timothy 4, 9 and following, people will disappoint you. Tonight you have to know that. You have to know that people will disappoint you, even people that you trust, even your church family. There may be somebody in this room that disappointed you. They've let you down, right? They've hurt your feelings. They've hurt your family. If they haven't, they will before it's all said and done. That's just the fact of the matter. People will disappoint you, even people that you love. And the temptation for us is to just withdraw and to cut them off and to just be bitter and upset and have a tendency to just stop all of our relationships, to put our guard up and say, I'll never let anyone know me like that ever again. I don't want to get to know other people like that again. But the example I think Paul left for us in 2 Timothy 4 was, no, you stand by those people. If anything, it should give you a reason to want to know them more and to get to know them more and to pour into the lives of other people. You say, why, Paul? Why can you do that? How can you rise above the pain of the disappointment that those people brought? I know I disappointed God, and he stood by me. So the very least I can do is to stand by the people who disappointed. I was challenged by that, needed that over the last couple of weeks, that it's been really hard sometimes with people. When you deal with people, it's hard. It's hard not to react the way that humans want to react, to get upset and to just stop trying and putting in all of the effort. But I see how Paul responded, and it makes me want to do better. It makes me want to try harder, to double down and invest in the lives of people, even though I know that they're going to hurt me, because I'm conscious and aware of the fact that I disappoint God so often. And I do a better job of investing in the lives of people, maybe even my church family, letting them see the real me, getting to know them so I can see the real them, and standing by them even through the disappointments and hurt. Maybe you're here tonight and you've been disappointed by somebody. Maybe you've been disappointed by somebody and you were just like, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm cutting them off. I'm done. I want to challenge you tonight. Double down and try even harder. Try even harder to stand by those people and to lift them up and to encourage them. Maybe you were the one that disappointed someone else. Why not fix that tonight? Why not put those things behind you and make it right? Or maybe you just realize that there's something else going on in your life, and while God stands beside you when no one else will, God will also pick up all the broken things that happen in our lives. It may not have to do with relationships at all. It may be just something you're dealing with. Whatever your need is tonight, why don't you come while we stand and while